Imagine a world where you use your compelling drawings to convince your clients of your vision, to impress your peers with beautiful sketches without the fear of drawing, and the ability to function remotely from a traditional office environment. What would that mean for your life and career? Well, I want to show you a process that makes this entirely possible with a new workflow predicated on using the iPad. The workshop I'm going to show you today is a lesson taken straight out of my iPad for Architects Masterclass, where I teach you how to save time, draw more confidently, and be more creative in the design process. This video is a behind the scene breakdown of my try and true hand render workflow. It's perfect if you want to create compelling hand drawn renderings for client presentations, planning reviews, and marketing materials. You get to see my process, special tips and tricks, and amazing strategies that you can implement right away. This is my classic workflow that I use in all my design illustrations with clients who are interior designers, architects, and developers. My name is Henry Gao, and I've been teaching architecture graphics since completing my graduate studies at Cornell University in 2014. And I have found teaching is one of my great passions in life. That's me in the picture leading a group of aspiring future architects on a sketching tour in San Francisco. You see, I've always been drawn to pen and paper ever since I was little. Nothing felt more right in this world than studying architecture, allowing me to continue my childhood passion. As an architecture designer, I wanted to make my life easier by upgrading the traditional design process involving trace, pencil, and scale so that I could bring back the fun in drawing with the ability to edit, iterate, and revise. So in 2017, I began developing my own workflow, crafting templates and guides for me to use in my day-to-day position as a project designer. As time went on, I perfected my methods and techniques with the right app, and now I can iterate designs like never before, edit my drawings instantly without needing a computer, printer, or a scanner, and produce compelling drawings that are used in client presentations, planning reviews, and marketing materials. When I became really proficient, I started sharing this knowledge online, teaching my methods, techniques, and strategies. I stressed not only how important drawing is, but about the numerous upsides that comes from adopting a digital workflow. So my personal mission is to help you save time, draw better, and design faster as an architect or interior designer using the iPad. So with that said, let's get into the workshop. I want to begin by showing you this exterior hand rendering. And this was part of a series of other images that were submitted for a house in Northern California during the permit phase. And this was ultimately approved by the city. And we used very similar renderings like this in other jurisdictions around California. Over the years, this has become kind of the classic workflow that I've been relying on. So I really want to show you how this is made and the kind of layer structure that went into this. So if you look into the layers palette, you'll see that essentially I always have this sort of in my layers. So it's gonna start with the texture paper on the top, and then I have a shadow layer from the SketchUp model, which I will go into deeper with both of these. And then it's followed by the pen group and the color and the background group. So starting from the very bottom, this background folder is going to be comprised of a Rhino model provided by my colleague who is working on this project. But you can use SketchUp model. They all have very similar export setting where all you need is really just this kind of a line weight background for you to trace on top. It doesn't have to be very detailed. As you can see in here, this model was really built without any sort of thickness in mind. And these are the kind of things that I think you can add in very quickly in a 2D view than spending the time to build it out in 3D. The less modeling that you can save yourself in 3D, the quicker you'll get with the hand drawing. So in general, when I'm trying to model something, I'm trying to do as little as possible because I know when I'm drawing this out, I can do a lot of these detail in its 2D perspective than in the 3D world. So when you're tracing, It's also a good idea just to reduce the opacity a little bit so that you can see your pen line work a little bit better. But ultimately, this layer is going to be turned off at the end, so it doesn't really matter if it's turned all the way up or down. After you have sort of this right setting and opacity, and then that's when I move into my drawing folder. And this actually wasn't a folder. I ultimately like made it a folder after all the layers were created. But I'm going to show you what the first layer and what I ended up doing after creating this first initial layer. So this initial layer is really just the house. You're really building the bones, the foundation, and the skeleton of the house. And in here, you don't really need to get into the details of the texture or materiality or anything that will intersect the lines, because in case you need to erase something, you don't want to be erasing things that you might need to redraw. So as a rule of thumb, I try to keep it simply to the outline of the building as much as possible without adding the details. And once you have this background built, this layer on top that I call is the background, that ultimately named as a background. And this background is comprised of all the trees and the vegetations in the background. And I want to keep my architecture separate away from the trees and the grass, just because I think that is kind of easy to identify. And also, I don't want my trees and the foliages to touch the line work. And then in the layer above that is where I've added in all the textures. And this will include concrete on the building side, the wood vertical siding, and the roof kind of a texture. And texture typically goes on their own layer, and you'll occasionally see there are bits and pieces of lines that doesn't quite belong to this texture layer, and that's kind of just mistakes on my part, where I probably just drew those things and didn't realize that they were not supposed to be drawn on this texture layer. But that's okay. If you're really OCD about it, you can actually just move these bits of lines using your cut and paste tool and paste it into a different layer and then merge it into the layer that they're supposed to be on. But, for the most part, I don't see that as a necessity. So I try to move as fast as I can in the drawing. So that doesn't bother me. But some of you actually, that kind of things will bother you. So just letting you know, there is a solution to move these extra line works that are not in the right layer to a different layer. This miscellaneous layer, are things that doesn't really fall into any of the other kind of categories. So things in here are the people on the interior, some of the grass, and some of the shadow and shading line work, like here, for example. So those are the things that I want to just keep it in a layer by itself and not part of other layers. When you do this, you may ultimately decide that who cares? It's not that much line work. I'll keep it with other layers, and that's really up to you. The most important thing is to keep the texture layer away from your basic geometry, because if you wanted to erase the texture layer and adding a different material, you don't need to erase the line work of the building that's containing it. And on this very top layer is a tree. And this is probably atypical because, usually you have this tree as part of the background with the vegetation. But the reason why this was on a layer of its own was this tree was actually added in later when I realized there should be a tree in front of the house. So that was added in later on as a different layer. And this was actually added in with a red pen just so I could sketch over it and see how it looked in front of the background. So when it's all done, you can just make that red pen and make it into a black using your saturation tool. So that really is all there is to the pen folder. When I'm done with the pen work, that's when I start coloring. And in coloring, the workflow is similar and different. You want to color into different layers based on their texture or their materials. For me, I like to separate things out from the sky to the vegetation. And this vegetation can really be broken down into grass, trees, and flowers if you want to make it into different layers. But for me, their colors are fairly close enough, so I don't mind if it's on the same layer. And the other buildings are essentially, the houses that are outside of the main design. And you'll see the sequence of building this on is I'm always building it from the far background. So in this case, it's the sky, and you can see that a lot of this is bleeding into the vegetation. And this, I actually just used a watercolor brush. That's how I was able to achieve this really nice and gradation that really looks like a watercolor is bleeding into the paper. But with real watercolor, it would be very hard to control where the color ends. So with this, clearly it's bleeding into other part of the drawing, but that's okay because when you're adding the vegetation, so the greeneries in the background, that essentially, because it's a layer on top of the sky, that is just going to mask off the part where it's bleeding into the trees. So this by itself will save you a lot of trouble, just so that you don't have to be erasing your sky to be perfectly outside the boundary of your line work. When this is on, you'll also see that the trees, the greeneries, they are bleeding into the architecture and the buildings themselves. And the same idea is true here, that when you have colored in other buildings or other part of the drawing, like for example here it's other building, and that is going to mask off the part that bled into the building. And the same thing with the concrete and the glass. Well, not so much the glass, but the wood. The wood is the part of the building that will cover the green, and then the ground texture. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 layers in here. You could have a little bit more depending on the different kind of things you have in your drawing. I typically like to group things that are similar in color one to another. So if trees and grass are similar enough in tonality, I'll make it into a same layer. If certain colors that are close to one another, I'll group that together as well. The idea here is that, if you want to edit the color, for example, using the hue, saturation, and brightness, you can really tweak the hue or the saturation or the brightness, if you will. You can tweak those things without affecting other colors in the drawing. And this is really the primary principle for separating out your layers like I have. So I just did a couple of undos to go back. And this is just going to be very easy to individually tweak colors without impacting other layers. So for me, it's a very non-destructive workflow. So if you want to have more flexibility, then you want to separate your colors out even more into their own layers. But at a certain point, it might actually be more work to keep track of all the different layers and the things that are assigned to these layers. So for me, it's pretty basic. I'll have my trees, the skies, the textures, and in here, there isn't people in here, but if I had entourage like people or dogs, they would be on their own separate layer because they would have a more of a vibrant color if I were to color it in. So now that we're done with the color and pen, which is really the bulk of the work here, you also see that this is something that I haven't really touched on before, was you'll see this vegetation on this vegetation layer. There is there's some gradation to the tree and the grass too, where the light is hitting on this side. I made the tree to be a little brighter, and where the shadow is, naturally it will be a little darker. Once you fill in the color on this layer, what you can do to give this sort of gradation look and the shadow look is to turn on your alpha lock. And I talk about this in my tutorial. Alpha lock is going to lock the areas where this color, where the pixel is impacting on this area. So let me just do that as example. So now the alpha lock is on. So if I took a brush and the same watercolor brush, if I selected a yellow, if I only wanted to affect the tree, I don't want to color anything else, this alpha lock is going to allow you to lock to the area of the tree or the grass, and this isn't going to affect the building. And that is really the beauty of the alpha lock, and I use this all the time. This is one of those things that I cannot live without. So that's how I'm able to get this sort of a nice gradation without impacting other color. If you have this turned on, make sure to turn it off if you do want to color into a new area, because if you have this turned on and you realize for some reason you cannot draw in other areas, let's say in the sky, just as a bad example, that's the reason why it does not let you draw in those areas. Now, this shadow layer used to be part of the background. So usually when I bring in the background from either SketchUp or Rhino, this shadow layer here, I'm gonna just turn this on so you guys can see what that looks like. And when it's brought in, it's actually on the normal blending mode. So it looks like this, which is not much by its own. But the idea of bringing this layer in here is so I can do a very easy kind of a blending mode and a hack to introduce some three-dimensional quality to the rest of the drawing. So let me just turn everything back on. And because the shadow layer is currently on the most bottom layer, what I do is bring this up, all the way up to the very top layer. Actually, let me go back because I automatically made a layer over there, made a group over there. So if I bring this all the way up, you'll see that this is on top of other layers, and it's not good because this is not letting you see through the things down below. So the trick here is to make this to not overlay. Overlay is used for the paper texture, but multiply. So multiply is just a very subtle thing that you can blend this shadow layer into your existing geometry. And in this example, maybe it's not as useful or noticeable, but in other drawings that I've done, having this quick hack is really going to bring in the three-dimensional quality to the drawing. And it really takes no time, right? You have the model, you can save this as a shadow layer and just bring it in. The one thing I want to make a note here is you can see the edges are a little blurred. And this is actually done manually when I brought them in, because these are the edges that were casted as a shadow by the tree in Rhino. Or so they more or less, they had this very harsh geometry. If I did not blur this on the rendering or on the drawing, it would have a very hard shadow. And for architecture, that's fine. But if you had like this sort of harsh shadow on grass, for example, that isn't going to look very natural. So to do that, you just go into your smudge tool and then you can select any of these brushes. So I'm just going to demonstrate as an example. So I've selected my marker brush. And what I would do is, simply just go on the edges until these lines are just a little bit blurred. And I don't do this like religiously to every single line. I only do it to areas where I think it's going to make the biggest impact visually. There are, of course, other places where I haven't done this, but you can't really notice that. So there's really no point in doing that unless it's really in the foreground. And if I didn't do this, there would be a very sharp line in the grass. That said, the last thing, which I've already shown you before, is this paper texture, right? And this paper texture, I'm gonna just turn this off because I want to show you the texture of the paper. And this is a watercolor paper that I really made it really big and zoomed in, so you can really see the granular quality of the paper itself. It's even got some red marks on here, which I don't love. So the idea here is to blend this using an overlay blending mode. And you can see in this particular drawing, having that blended into the drawing really takes the digital look of the watercolor effect and really introduces a paper quality to it. So this is also one of my go-to technique, that if you are looking to make your drawing look less digital. And the thing about this is that depending on the tonality of your color or whatnot, like you can see how dark this texture is. So what you can do here is you could use your saturation tool. You can increase or decrease your paper texture, this layer, to lighten or darken the effect of this kind of paper. You can also do the same thing with your curve. If I made it a little brighter, you can see that overall, this is going to impact the entire brightness in that. But what I like to do sometimes is I'll actually make a small S curve like this. And this is going to just bring out the texture a little bit more. So if your drawing isn't showing the texture as much as you like, I would tweak this part and this part of the curve adjustment to enhance the texture of the paper. But I actually think this is too much. So I'm gonna just double tap and go back to the way it was, which was right here. So this really sums up the kind of basic workflow of this process. So if you thought this was really difficult to start with, now you can see there's a formula to this. And if you follow this formula and be patient with yourself, especially the drawing part, I think the rest will come a little bit easier. So I know a lot of people aren't great or super proficient with a drawing. So I would spend most of your time in getting the drawing to look good first. Coloring is actually pretty easy in my opinion. It's almost like painting in between the lines, and putting the shadow on takes no time. Putting the paper texture on put no time. So your drawing could really look like this in your own workflow. I hope you enjoyed this workshop. Many of my students have achieved amazing results, cutting their learning in half just by watching my free resources from my YouTube channel and received in my newsletters. With that in mind, I have a free gift for you today. Please join my free 3-part workshop series called iPads for Architects. This is a free training guide that I send to all my new email subscribers. You will find important workflow concepts and tons of digital download materials, including brush settings, guides, template, and case study files like this one from the video to get you started. So if you are ready, join my community and I'd love to serve you even more in the future.